Alright guys, so in our last section of notes, we talked a great deal about, big businesses like Carnegie Steel and the Standard Oil Company, led by Rockefeller, and we talked about how they gained control of industries and goods and using horizontal and vertical consolidation. We talked a little bit about the life of a worker, the fact that they had to work long hours in terrible conditions and received very little pay. We talked a little bit about child labor and what their experience was like. So in this section of notes, we're going to talk about how workers join together and form labor unions to fight against these bad working conditions, the long hours, the insignificant pay, and so on and so on. Alright, so how are workers exploited by big business? The average laborer worked 12 hours a day and 6 days a week. Men often worked 7 days a week. They did not receive any benefits, so there was no vacation or sick leave, no unemployment compensation, or injury benefits. So for example, as a teacher today, I receive vacation time. Obviously I get the summer off, and then I also get 3 days of personal leave that I can use whenever I want, and I don't have to have a reason to use that leave. And then I also have sick leave, so I have 3 weeks of sick leave that I can use, and I'll be paid for all of my vacation days and all of my sick days. If for some reason I was to lose my job and I could prove that I'm actively searching, I could also receive unemployment compensation. And if I were to be injured while at work, the expense for the doctor's visit, any expenses that I might need because of that injury would all be covered. These are things that were not available in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so just another reason why workers were joining together and trying to make changes. So in 1882, 675 factory workers were killed each week because of dangerous working conditions, and obviously this included children as well. Alright, so how are women and children treated in industry? Wages are so low that most women and children had to work to survive. So men are barely making enough money to make ends meet, and so that's why women and children are also forced to work so that their family can survive. 20% of children under 12 worked full-time. The youngest full-time employee is only around 4 years old. Children earn an average of 0.02 an hour, and women earn half as much as their male counterparts. Okay, so what is the workers' response to labor exploitation? Essentially, labor unions emerge. Unions represent the first multi-gender, multiracial, multi-class organizations in the United States. One of the very first labor unions to form was the National Labor Union. This was a large-scale union. It had over 600,000 members. And it eventually did get Congress to legalize an 8-hour workday for government workers. Here on this slide are just a few other labor unions that formed during this time. So we'll start from the top. American Federation of Labor, the AFL. This was founded by Samuel Gompers and forms after the Knights of Labor. This was a craft union, and only skilled workers were allowed. So if you were an unskilled worker, you were not allowed to join this labor union. Within this union, Samuel Gompers used successful strikes to win higher wages and shorter work weeks. They also used collective bargaining. For those of you that don't know what collective bargaining is, it just means that workers negotiate as a group and not as individuals. So an example of this would be several years back when the NFL football players were trying to reach agreements with their owners. They were trying to get additional pay and also a shorter football schedule, so less games. And for a time there, we weren't sure if we were going to have an NFL season because, they could not reach any sort of agreement. And so this is an example of collective bargaining because the football players kind of come together as a whole and make demands towards the owners to get what they want. And luckily they did reach an agreement in time for football season, or my husband would have lost his mind. Wobbly. So this is the International Workers of the World. Did not like the AFL and focused on unskilled workers. Okay, so simply the Wobblies did not like the AFL because they excluded certain groups of people. This union was led by Eugene V. Debs. Many radical socialists were the group's leaders, including Eugene V. Debs. Many of their strikes were extremely violent. Eugene V. Debs, this is a quote coming exactly from him, or directly from him, I'm sorry. The strike is the weapon of the oppressed. And so he really believed in strikes and believed that they were the answer. Eugene V. Debs also started the American Railway Union and led the Pullman strike. And we will talk a little bit more about the Pullman strike soon. And he was also the 5-time candidate of the Socialist Party of America for President of the United States. And unfortunately, he lost all 5 times. Poor guy. All right, Knights of Labor. Formed in Philadelphia, membership was open to all people. This included African Americans, women, skilled, unskilled. We saw farmers, factory workers, shopkeepers, and even office workers. Their goal, wanted to get equal pay for equal work, as well as an 8-hour workday, and see child labor ended. They were not big on strikes, but they realized that maybe that was the only way. And they actually achieve a lot of power from strikes. After a few bad strikes with some violence, they lose a lot of members and power. And obviously this is not good for the Knights of Labor, but also not good for labor unions as a whole. All right, so what movement branches off of labor unions? Socialism. Socialism is a economic and political philosophy that favors public instead of private ownership of means of production. This is basically a less extreme version of communism. So an example of socialism would be if you own 2 cows, the government would take both of them, make them public property, and put them in a barn with everyone else's cows, then give you as much milk as they think you need. So those cows are no longer yours. They are, again, public property. And again, socialism is on that scale, on your way to communism, with everything being owned by the public. And so with socialism, again, not everything is going to be public ownership. It's probably going to be mostly public ownership, but then some private ownership, where communism would be entirely everything is public ownership. Socialism also would believe in sharing the wealth, so everyone basically having the same amount of money. So they believe that wealth should be distributed equally to everyone. They believe that when it comes to business, we should cooperate with one another, not compete against each other. And most Americans actually oppose socialism. So the exploitation of workers and the accumulation of wealth by the rich causes tension. And so we start to see this gap between the poor and the rich. And that's why some people turn to socialism, because it does have its appeal. The fact that all the wealth would be redistributed evenly definitely appeals to that working class that's seriously struggling at this time. Eugene V. Debs and the IWW, International Workers of the World, pushed for National Socialism. Now understand that the majority of people were not in favor of socialism, whether they were poor or rich. So rich people obviously weren't in favor of it, because this would mean that some of their wealth that they've worked hard for, in some cases, would be taken from them. The working class was not really in favor of it either, because they believed in capitalism and they believed in that as America's economic system, and that if you worked really, really hard, you got to keep those profits. And it was kind of like that American dream that we can improve ourselves and we can, support ourselves with hard work. And that's kind of taken away if we move towards socialism and even communism. All right, so what occurred due to the new socialist outlook? Strikes. When workers voluntarily refuse to work, strikes become violent. One example of this would be the Haymarket Square. In this strike, 1,200 protest in Chicago for an 8-hour workday in 1886, and it was not successful. Homestead strike. With this one, Henry Frick tried to cut wages at Carnegie Steel. Scabs, which are replacement workers, are used for the first time. So basically, because these people went on strike, refused to work, they bring in scabs or replacement workers to kind of fill the position until the strike ends. Union lost support when it turned violent. So again, not successful. Pullman strike. President Cleveland ends the strike. He puts it down. He ends up jailing Debs, who was the leader of this strike, and has all strikers fired. So with the Pullman strike, their goal here, they wanted to, or sorry, not the goal, but what had happened to them was their wages were cut by 25%. Some workers were even laid off, and workers also felt that Pullman exercised too much control over the workers and the talent he had built for them. So essentially, he hired them, and then he built a town for them, and so he controls every part of that town. He controlled the store, he controlled the homes, he controlled every bit of it. And so he could control how much to charge for alcohol. He could control how much to sell the food for in the town. He could control how high your rent was. And so they just felt like he had way too much control over them. So understand the Pullman strike was a boycott of Pullman railway cars. And also understand that none of these strikes were successful, and many were injured, and some were even killed. So what was America's reaction to the strikes? Public opinion turns against laborers. After violence erupts, many people don't want a part of labor unions because of the violence. Companies begin to forbid union activities. Employees are forced to sign yellow dog contracts, which basically it was a contract that they had to sign promising to never join a union or participate in a strike, and employers forbade union meetings and fired union organizers. Organizing became increasingly difficult. Laws are passed limiting union activity, and fear of socialism leads to loss of favor as well. In addition, we talked a little bit about the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Remember, this outlawed trusts and any other contracts that restrained free trade. Though this act eventually did become extremely important in regulating business, in its early years it was rarely enforced. In fact, the act was so loosely phrased that it sometimes had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of regulating business monopolies, it regulated the labor unions that challenged these monopolies. In the 1890s, courts invoked the Sherman Antitrust Act to restrain laborers' right to strike, ruling that strikes violated the Act's prohibition against a conspiracy in restraint of trade. Big business thus then benefited from the judiciary's pro-business stance and its unwillingness to restrict commercial behavior. It was not until the early 1900s that government began to enforce the Sherman anti-regulatory policies in full. So basically here, not only were the labor unions having to fight against their business owners, their bosses, but also against the government, because the government at the beginning here is going to support these big business leaders. And we'll talk a little bit more as to why that was a little later on. And so basically this is just another reason as to why the labor unions were not being successful.